Hi, everyone. My name's Austin Zollner. First, I want to say thank you to everyone in attendance tonight for coming to this board meeting. And during this brief presentation, I will just be sort of touching up on religion in schools and just things to be aware of within our district. So, the purpose for today is not to persuade you one way or the other as I get into sort of these more difficult topics like prayer in schools and things like that. My whole point is just to be neutral, and I am going to eliminate any personal bias as best I can. My main purpose, like I said, is just to inform you on the policies, the laws, the current administrative stance on certain issues, and then as well as the U.S. Department of Education guidance. So that's what I'm here for tonight. I'll be basing this talk on three main articles, which will be referenced throughout, and you can find those resources at the end of the presentation as well as in your handouts tonight. On top of that, there will be several court cases referenced as well. So, a little background before we talk about religion in the schools. We need to sort of take a step back and think about, okay, what's the important background information before we jump in. So the three things that I'll talk about first are freedom of speech, Establishment Clause, and the Equal Access Act. So freedom of speech, I know we are all at least somewhat familiar with this. It's protected under the First Amendment. And its main point is that private speech endorsing religion is protected by the free speech and free exercise clauses. That keyword there, private, is where a lot of the sort of disagreements come into effect. And freedom of speech has often been cited by many religious clubs to try to gain sponsorship and resources. So that is freedom of speech. Our next one is the Establishment Clause. So the main part about the Establishment Clause is that the government speech endorsing religion is forbidden, not allowed, right? So anything at the federal level is not allowed. And on top of being at the federal level, this clause also applies to the states as well. And this was confirmed in Cantwell versus Connecticut in 1940, as well as Everson versus the Board of Education of Ewing Township in 47. A direct quote from the U.S. Department of Education states that the Establishment Clause prohibits state officials from making judgments about what constitutes an appropriate prayer and from favoring or disfavoring certain types of prayers. So that is the Establishment Clause to keep in mind. And then finally, the Equal Access Act. This was passed back in 1984, and its main goal was essentially that it would be withholding funds from schools that were discriminating on the basis of religion or political viewpoint, specifically in terms of supporting extracurricular activities, or not supporting extracurricular activities based on religion or political viewpoint. As a whole, this act has benefited mainly gay, lesbian, and evangelical Christian clubs. So those are the main ones that seem to benefit from the Equal Access Act. And this act has been challenged many times throughout history, but it has been upheld in essentially all court cases dating back to 1990, 95, 01, 06, and as recent as 2010. So now we come to actual prayer and religion in schools, and I'll just briefly talk about our current administrative stance in terms of the federal level, as well as what is allowed and what is not allowed. So at the federal level, our current administration holds this position, and they have updated their 2003 guidance on prayer in the schools. So, this is 17 years in the making for this update. And this update has stated that teachers and other public school officials acting in their official capacities may not lead their classes in prayer, devotional readings from the Bible, or other religious activities. The president has stated more specifically that schools will lose funding if they violate their students' rights to religious expression. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go forward. So then, if we're wondering what is allowed, well, there are several specific religious activities that actually are allowed. These do include prayer and religious readings during non-instructional times, so passing time, lunch, recess, and this example is for both students and staff. So that is perfectly fine. Prayer groups and religious clubs run by students are totally fine, and staff and faculty can participate as well, as long as they are not acting in their official role, essentially. As long as they are removing themselves from the teacher role and using that as influence, they are able to also start or join these prayer groups and religious clubs. And finally, prayer and non-prayer during moments of silence. So if there's a moment of silence, students and staff are able to pray or not to pray. You can't force anyone to do one or the other. So those are a few examples of things that are allowed. But in terms of things that are not allowed, they are pretty specific, but also pretty broad, and there's some generalizations that have to be made. So teachers are not allowed to lead the class in a prayer or have the class partake in devotional readings from the Bible or some other religious text. Teachers are also not allowed to force students to participate in religious activities. On top of that, teachers are not allowed to penalize students due to missing class due to participation in off-premises religious instruction. So you can't take away points if a student has to leave for a separate religious obligation. And finally, you cannot penalize students due to religious information included on academic work. Now, that's not to say students can't be penalized for their content, but specifically only the content alone can be graded, and you have to look at the work as a whole and remove the fact that there's religious information in there in your assessment and grading. So those are just a few examples of prayer and religion in schools, and the importance of sort of doing our research as a district just to make sure that we are following everything as needed. So here's just a list of the 3 main sources I used. It was the NPR Radio Kansas article, Pew Center Research Center, and the U.S. Department of Education. So like I said, here are my references, and I do hope you take some time to review them in the hopes that we can all sort of take something away from this and be more prepared in the future. So again, I thank you and have a great night.